Pray for Pastor Blake as he brings forth the word. We thank you that he speaks with boldness and confidence, that you anoint him far above his natural abilities, and he imparts words of life to us, and we receive it. For we ask it in your precious name. And all God's people said, amen.
You want to track along with me this morning with the message notes. They're inside your worship bulletin. And if you're kind of a first-time visitor or have been here in a while, we're starting into this series called The Year of the Story. It's going to be 52 weeks. We're going from Genesis to Revelation, and we're going to take 2 weeks in creation. So you're probably going to wonder how we're going to get through the whole Bible. We're taking 2 weeks in creation. But I wanted to just give you a little time to kind of get caught up, get into the flow of things. We're using this resource here. It's available for free. It's called Through the Bible Through the Year. At least a 4-week sampler is available to you. And then if you want to be reading to get the whole flow of the Bible, we're making available these Bibles called The Story that are in a chronological order to the, or puts the Bible in chronological order, and it's a little bit of a Reader's Digest version of it. So all of these things are available out in the lobby. So I love to hear testimonies like Jagad's. And I love to hear how God is at work in other cultures. That's not just a God of kind of North America, what I grew up exposed to, but that God is the King of the universe. I also love to find out about church history and to see how God has been at work in other times and in other places. I read the story of a Russian Orthodox priest. He was known as Father John. And he died about 100 years ago, but he served for 53 years in the same blue-collar city in Russia. And in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, this city was racked with alcoholism. Families were being destroyed by it. And you would literally find people in the gutters. And Father John made it his business to go out and care for those who were succumbing to the power of alcohol. And he was known to actually take people in his arms and to speak to them words of encouragement. Now, I would think that if you saw the same person, you might be like, shame on you. Here you are again. But Father John was known to cradle these drunks in his arm and to say to them, this is beneath your dignity. You were created to house the fullness of God. And that expression just blows me away. In just such a simple line, we're reminded of who we have been created to be. This is beneath your dignity. You were created to house the fullness of God. And that brings us to the theme of this morning's message. And in Latin, it is known as the Imago Dei, or the image of God. And when we read about the creation account, we read that God not only created the heavens and the earth and all of the living creatures, but on day 6, that God created humanity. And so we look at Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. It says this, then God said, let us make humanity in our image to resemble us, so that they may take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the earth, and all the crawling things on earth. God created humanity in God's own image. There it is, the Imago Dei. In the divine image, God created them. Male and female, God created them. Now, I suggested last week that we need to get an understanding of creation right. Because it lays the foundation for all of Scripture. It's not like you can just go, well, I'll get past that. I want to get to the good stuff, the story of the Exodus, or I just want to get to the New Testament and the story about Jesus. Because everything is built on the creation story. Jesus himself returns and at times references the creation story. We got to get this part right because it lays the blueprint. So when we talk about that humanity is made in the image of God, that every person has the Imago day, there's a ton of things, implications of that. We could spend the whole fall kind of unpacking it. One of the implications might be of saying that everybody we encounter this week has the image of God. In some cases, it's more distorted and marred. And by the way, it's marred in all of us because in Genesis chapter 3, humanity began to not follow God exclusively, but to respond to Satan's temptations. And so the image in us is marred, but it is still there. Some people, it's more dramatically broken than in others, but in everyone we encounter, there's the image of God. Maybe this is why Jesus in Matthew 25 talks about when you did this for me, the least of these, when you found me naked, or you found me hungry, you found me thirsty, you did it for me. Or maybe we could look at this story of us being created in God's image, male and female, He created them, and we could step back and say, you know what? We express the image of God in a most healthy way in our families, in our workplace, in our church, when both male and female are utilizing their gifts, are in places of leadership, are serving together, that God's image is most clearly reflected. But I'm not going to talk about those. I'm not going to talk about another handful of implications. Instead, this morning, I want to just focus on two things, and I'm going to tell you exactly what they are now. You can fill in the blanks if you want to do that. The very first one is this, is that because we're creating the image of God, we have the capacity to resemble God in our character. And the second one I'll talk about in a few minutes is that we have the call to represent and reflect God in our context. So just two big takeaways from the idea that you have been created in the image of God is that you have the capacity to resemble God in your character, and you have the call upon you to represent and reveal God in your context. So we get this first idea right there in Genesis 1:26. God said, let us make humanity, male and female, let us make humanity in our image to resemble us. To resemble us. Some of you maybe recognize my dad and my brother were here last Sunday. And my brother visited before, and I forget who it was, but someone noticed that they looked like me. And I went to my brother and asked if he was my father. Oh man, I love that. But last week, my brother was here. He's 10 years older than me. And my dad was here. He's 30 years older than me. And if my wife wants to know what I'm going to look like in 10 years, she can look at my brother. If she wants to know what I'm going to look like in 30 years, she can look at my dad. It's kind of a foregone conclusion. I remember going through some family photos, and I came across this photo of me when I was 18. I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and I was sitting somewhere, and I didn't recognize the setting. And I'm looking at that, and I'm trying to figure out, where in the world was that picture taken? And I turned it over and looked at the writing on the back, and it was a picture of my dad. I thought it was me. I mean, that's how much I look like. And that's when I kind of finally realized that what he looks like now is what, if I live to be that long, what I'll look like. You know, there's an argument in schools and in science and in other settings, you know, how much of a way a child is nature and how much of it is nurture. How much of it is just the way they're hardwired, their kind of DNA, their genes, and how much of it is their environment. Well, in my case, I clearly see that there's some stuff that's clearly nature. God, kind of the way He put the genes within my family, that I look like my dad. But not only do I look like my dad, I have my dad's mannerisms. And I don't think that's DNA. I think that's from me observing my dad for 54 years. My dad actually is a public speaker. My dad gives speeches about Franklin Roosevelt. And so I notice that when I talk, I have some of my dad's mannerisms. I notice when my dad tells a joke, I tell a joke like my dad tells a joke. The way my dad interacts with people, I interact with people very similarly to the way my dad does. So on the one hand, there's the capacity, there's kind of the nature side of it. I'm going to look like my dad, but also because of my exposure over a long period of time, I also have mannerisms. I act like my dad. We have the capacity to resemble God in our moral character. But it's not a foregone conclusion if we're going to act like God in our moral character. That depends on how close we are, how much we're exposed to, how much we observe and walk with them. So Genesis 1 and 2 tell us the creation account. Really, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are all about kind of laying the foundation for the rest of the story. And so there's a lot of crossover, a lot of reference to one another in those first 11 chapters. So for example, in Genesis 5, we read this, that on the day God created humanity, now it's going back to Genesis 1. On the day God created humanity, he made them to resemble God. Right? We've already got this information, but there's a reason why we're being told it again. And he created them male and female. We've got that part, but we're being told again. He blessed them and called them humanity on the day they were created. All of that is just kind of reminding us because of what now we're going to be told. Verse 3, when Adam was 130 years old, he became the father of a son in his image, resembling him, and named him Seth. It's not an accident that that language of a son in his image, resembling him, is repeated right after we're told that we are made in God's image to resemble him. In a sense, what is being set up for us, I believe, here in Genesis 5, is this now option that we have. This choice, this kind of Seth scenario that every human has. Are we going to follow our forefather Adam in his obedience to God? Because we know there's times that Adam was obedient. Or are we going to follow Adam, our forefather, in his disobedience to God? Because we know he was disobedient as well. We have this dilemma. We're made in God's image, but we're also made in the image of fallen humanity. We have this capacity, but we also have this reality warring against living into that capacity. So in Genesis 6, the very next chapter, we see this on display. It's the story of Noah. The Lord saw that humanity had become thoroughly evil. That is, that humanity had chosen to go this way, had chosen to follow their spiritual forefather and biological forefather Adam in his disobedience. And they had become thoroughly evil, except, verse 8, but for Noah, the Lord approved of him. Verse 9, Noah was a moral and exemplary man. In other words, Noah was embracing and walking in the image of God that he was created to be. And Noah walked with God. I want to suggest something to you. Maybe this is obvious to you, or maybe once I say it, it'll become obvious to you, or maybe it'll be something that is kind of a new concept. But I want to make sure that we all understand that when we talk about salvation, we're not just talking about what happens at the end of our life. We're not just talking about we make a decision now and we kind of get our ticket punched so we go to heaven. Yes, that is a major benefit of being right with God, of being saved. But salvation is about us being restored into the image of God for which we are created. I mean, why are we told this part of the story? Why is this so important to us? Because God is all about bringing us back to that place where the image of God is being healed in us. You can look at it this way when we think of a triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that God the Father created us in his image, or in the image of the triune God. Jesus was sent to save us because we had rebelled against that. We had walked in our brokenness, our fallenness, and Jesus came to pay for the sin and to restore us so that we could be related again to the Father. And then the Father and the Son together sent the Holy Spirit so that we could have that image restored in us. The Apostle Paul, when he talks about salvation, by the way, the Apostle Paul uses this word, as do others in the New Testament. The word they use for salvation, we would pronounce it as sozo, S-O-Z-O. And it's always, whenever you hear the word salvation, it's almost always this word. But that's also the word for healing. Sometimes when it says that Jesus came upon a leper and he healed him, it is he sozoed him, he saved him. It means healing, or it means being protected from harm, being saved from something. And so I want you to think about salvation as not only where we go after we die into eternity, but that we are also, salvation is about us being healed. So the Apostle Paul says it this way. In Ephesians 4, by the way, on your notes, I had that incorrectly. I had it as Ephesians 5, but it's Ephesians 4:21. Since you really listened to him, that is to Jesus, and you were taught how the truth is in Jesus, change the former way of life that is part of the person you once were, corrupted by deceitful desires. What he's saying here is you were once, all of us, walking kind of freely, without much concern, within the broken image, the deceitful image that we had, corrupted image of God, and we weren't worried about it. But Paul is saying, now that you know that Jesus has come and died for you and been resurrected and is teaching you the way, you should live differently. So verse 23, instead, renew the thinking in your mind by the Spirit, and clothe yourself with the new person created according to God's image, in justice and true holiness. Paul is saying that the work of Jesus and the Holy Spirit is not just about a future pie in the sky kind of celebration, but it is about taking on the new person, the restored image of God that you were designed to be. So here's the first big idea. You were created with the capacity to resemble God in your moral character. So what? So what does that mean to you today? Now, let me assure you that none of us are going to get it all the way figured out until we're with Jesus. But it doesn't mean that we just kind of tread water and just kind of say, well, you know what, I'm a sinner, I'm just forgiven, I don't really have to worry about anything. God has given you the capacity, and he's given you his Son, and he's given you the Spirit so that you will work in this healing process. Some of you have heard me say before, the man who was a big spiritual mentor in my life had served as a high official in a local bank in Maryland, and he told me one time about how he would do job reviews, and he had someone who came in one time and wanted a raise, and the person said, I've got 30 years experience here. And he kind of corrected them in a gentle way, and he said, no, you have 1 year experience 30 times. And sometimes with Jesus, we say, in my case, Jesus, I've got 43 years experience with you. Do I really? Or do I have 1 year experience or 6 months experience 86 times? Are you just content? Maybe Jesus fixed a few things in your life so that you're no longer losing jobs, or now your marriage is not on the rocks, or something. If you've kind of gotten some of these major kind of overt sins taken care of, and you're just content. Or are you realizing that God's purpose is for you to resemble him more and more? Are you willing to come one more time and bring that thing that you struggle with, or maybe something he's just now brought to your attention, or maybe something that you've almost decided you're going to give up on because you've struggled with it for so long? Are you willing to say to Jesus one more time, I want all that you have for me. I want to experience your wholeness so that I might live in holiness. I'll be brief with the second point. The second point is this. Not only do we have the capacity to resemble God in our character, but we have the call to represent and reflect God in our context. So think about what your context is. Maybe you have a variety of contexts, but maybe it's your workplace. Maybe it's the factory you work at. Maybe it's the university you teach at. Maybe it's the school in which you serve. Or maybe it's your dorm room. Or maybe it's in your home. Maybe it's in your small group. Whatever context or multiple contexts. Do you realize that you were created in the image of God so that you would represent and reflect God there? Notice in that passage on day 6, when humanity is created, let us make humanity in our image to resemble us. And then there's a so that. To resemble us so that they may take charge of. God creates humanity in his image because he wants to place them in his creation to represent him. It says so that they could have authority over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over the livestock. God creates them to resemble him so that they could represent him accurately, reflect him accurately. Within the context of the ancient Near East, places like the Assyrian culture, the Babylonian culture, the Jewish culture, the Egyptian culture, the kings at that time, they had a practice. They didn't have Twitter like President Trump, where he can speak to millions of followers, or Facebook, or the 24-hour news cycle. So kings of that time, they had a strategy. That if they had, maybe this was their capital in Babylon, but they couldn't get to the far reaches of their empire, but they wanted the people there to know that they were still subjects to the king. And so they would set up statues of themselves all throughout their kingdom. So maybe you never met the king in person. Maybe you never traveled to the capital, but there would be some place near you that you would see his statue. It represented him, so that it made clear that he has authority. I think that's some of the language that's trying to be communicated to us as this story is being told, so that the people of that early part of history would remember, okay, I know how kings do it, how they set up their statues different places, and God is saying, I'm causing you to resemble me so that you can represent me. We see this in a number of places, even in Genesis and in the Old Testament. So in Genesis 2, for example, God creates a garden, and he puts Adam there to represent him. God creates the garden, but God says, I'm putting you here to run it, to manage it, to represent me in that context. So do it with justice, and do it with kindness, and do it with wisdom. But it's not just physical stuff like plants and animals that we are given authority over. We're also called to represent God in the lives of people. So, for example, Abraham was called out of his context, which was in Ur, which was in Mesopotamia, and he was told to go to another place, and he said, basically, you're going to represent me there. God said, I'm going to bless you. And then through you, I'm going to bless all the families of earth. Abraham, you are going to be like this statue of me, this representation of me, and all it means to enjoy me and to walk in my wisdom. And then by the time we get to the prophets like Isaiah, that calling is clearly understood as not just for one man, Abraham, but for all his descendants, where the Jews are described as a light to the nations. This one people, the Jewish people, Israel, they were understood that they were going to reflect God's goodness, God's wisdom, and God's grace to everyone. So what is your context? What does it matter that you were created to resemble God and to represent God and to reflect God? In the Ten Commandments, the very first one is, you should have no other gods before me. God is making it clear, I'm the only one worthy of your worship, the only one worthy of your allegiance, the only one worthy of your obedience. But then the second commandment, sometimes it feels redundant to us, is about not having idols. The first one is that I'm the only true God. And the second one is, you're not to make any representation of me. It's not about necessarily other gods. It's about not making any representation of me, not belittling me, and just kind of confining me into something. Have you ever thought about this? That God himself made an image of himself. And it's you. That maybe what God is saying in part is, don't let yourself off the hook. Don't think that you can just set up this idol over here, this image of me, and think that, oh, they're going to kind of take care of things. I'm the only true God, and I put my image in you, and I want you to represent me. when Laura and I moved to Amman, Jordan, in 2001, I was shocked to see these images of the king of Jordan. His name is King Abdullah. He was brand new on the throne. He's still there now. And I'm not used to this in America. But everywhere we went, when I lived there for 5 years, I saw at least 1,000 of these, maybe 3,000 or 4,000. They would be posters or they would be murals all over his kingdom. And it was a way of communicating that I am your king. You maybe have never been to my palace. Maybe you've never seen my motorcade come by you, but I am here. My influence extends here. In a sense, Jesus, the Father and the Spirit, the triune God, has said, I'm placing you all throughout my kingdom. I'm placing you in that school. I'm placing you in that factory. I'm placing you in that home. I'm placing you in that neighborhood. I'm placing you in that apartment complex because I want you to represent me. I want you to resemble me, and I want you to represent me and reflect me to the people. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you would make your word alive right now and stir us in our minds and our hearts. Lord, if I misspoke, if I was unclear, I just pray that you would take your truth